Hello and welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I am Carl Christensen and I am solo podcasting again today. It's the beginning of summer officially, and so all the rest of the team is off having fun. Today I'm going to be talking about the basics of building a podcast. I hesitated to do a podcast like this because it seems kind of recursive. It also seems ironic because it's Learn It from a Layman, and you guys, some of you have been listening to the podcast for a while. You know that we don't, we have a podcast that's functional. That's probably the best word for it. But there's a lot of professional podcasts out there, and you might just want to listen to them. But I did thought there's a lot of people out there that want to start a podcast, that have started podcasts and or are interested in what a podcast setup looks like. And so I thought it would be at least interesting to go through this experience that we've had doing the podcast and kind of what some of the insights that we've gained in the process that might be useful in other business ventures. So this podcast, Learn It from a Layman, was I call it my brainchild, but it was certainly a collaborative effort. We started looking at doing a podcast near the end of 2018. And I think it's important when you're thinking about doing a podcast to have established some co-hosts. Solo podcasting like I am right now can have benefits, but I think the biggest thing about having co-hosts is you have someone that you want to keep doing it with. And so having, and you have more expertise on board, right? So I've got co-hosts that have a significant expertise in certain areas and or interest in other areas. Like I said, Learn It from a Layman, the premise being that, actually we'll get to that in a second. So first of all, once again, as a brainchild, we're just thinking about ways that we could stay connected. As you've listened to the podcast, I've got family and friends and old friends, people that I've wanted to stay in contact with, but it's kind of hard to, especially as a guy, come up sometimes with ways to kind of just chat. And so this seemed like an ideal way to be able to do something constructive, something educational, while also just being able to stay in touch and stay connected to people that I thought had something useful, some useful thing to still add to both my experience in my life and also just the public. So that was kind of the background and the idea behind doing Learn It from a Layman, the podcast that we set up. So our first release was in 2019. And I'm not going to go through all the steps that you can look up online. You can Google what do you need to do to start a podcast. And I guess it is important that you have logos and a few episodes that you've pre-recorded. But the reality is, unless you put a lot of time and some financial backing into a launch, your launch is going to be important, but what's going to be more important is your long-term staying power, the ability that you have to just do something sustainable, to build a podcast library that people are interested in. So the launch matters, but it's just the first step. So, like I said, I'm not going to go through. I read the blogs beforehand. That if you're interested in building a podcast, you've read those same blogs that I read about the necessary steps beforehand. And I can't say that I know better, but I do know that it is insufficient. And that so anecdotally, when we launched. This is, like I said, we launched early 2019, I believe. We had, I think, 3, maybe 5 episodes that we launched right off the bat. And obviously, we were rookies. We didn't have a high budget, but we did have we thought some interesting ideas for the first couple podcasts. Turns out the way we went with the podcast eventually was very different than the way we launched. But the number of downloads that we had, even after setting up, we set up a Facebook page, we set up a Twitter account, we set up all those things. We had our podcast linked into Apple and Spotify, all those things right off the bat. And I think our first few episodes at the first month that we launched had like 100 downloads between all of them, which is like nothing, right? It could have all been family members. So, and I'm sure that there was ways to do a launch much better than we did. Reach out to marketing. You know, I'm sure there's people listening right now that have significantly better experience. But like I said, this is a layman podcast for laymen. And the idea being that you can launch something even if you don't have the credentials, if you just have something useful to say and that you can continue saying useful things for a while, eventually people will listen. And so once again, let's go to the idea of learn it from a layman. So when trying to figure out what our podcast was going to be about, we brainstormed a few different names, a few different ideas for what we were going to do. And like I said, even after launching, even after having the name Learn It From a Layman, it took us a while to kind of refine the message and the idea behind it. And as if you've listened to our podcast library, you know that it is it's not the case that we only have what you traditionally call laymen on the podcast. We've had a lot of people with a doctorate. Dr. Johnny, so a medical doctor, frequents the podcast. We've had, Brent Christensen, who was the ranking U.S. diplomat in Taiwan. We've had a number of people that have significant expertise in their fields. So the idea isn't that there isn't value in expertise. Of course there is. The idea is that even as someone that doesn't have the expertise, you can learn and you can identify areas in which you have interest and that you can even contribute. And so I guess that was the idea behind Learn It From a Layman, was that if we come together, we do some research and then we discuss and we kind of collectively gain knowledge. It's like a class outside of class, and it's a class with the only motivation. No, it's no longer the teacher told me. It's no longer I do this for a grade or I do this for a certificate. It's a collaborative effort to learn for the benefit of learning. And I guess that's once again the idea behind a layman is, or a classical layman, a layman that has desires to better him or herself and become more educated. And so if you're learning it from someone that's also doing the same thing as you feel like you're not looked down on. On the flip side, and something I've thought a lot about since launching the podcast, is if it's really easy to claim layman status, because then any mistake you make, you can just say, oh, well, I'm not an expert. And that's not the idea either. It's just too easy to be it's the cop-out answer of, oh, well, I didn't, that's not my field. I'd want to get everything right. Like we strive for getting accurate facts, correct information out there on all of the podcasts. But the layman, I hope, is humble enough to recognize that all science is an evolving, study. And humans are imperfect at learning even the existing science. Without biases and a variety of other things. So I don't want it to be the case that when you say learn it from a layman, you think, this is a bunch of fools that don't know what they're talking about, or people that just won't say, won't take accountability for getting something wrong. Just the idea that we're still learning and growing, but yes, we should be accountable for any mistake that we have. Which, by the way, if you listen to a prior podcast and you say, that fact isn't correct, please hit us up. For example, I think a few years ago we did a Basics of Music podcast, and we got called out on some of the information in that podcast. And candidly, I appreciate it. I will give you a tongue-in-cheek answer. I think we did on our Facebook page where they called us out. But in reality, I love criticism. And it takes a long time to get to that point, but I love it. I love hearing like, oh, this is what you should have done better, because that's how you get better. Okay, off of that soapbox, let's move back to the building a podcast. So we've established this idea, refined it over the last number of years. So we have this learn it from a layman idea of researching and collaboratively growing and then sharing for the benefit of education. And so it's an idea that is easy to get behind, at least for me, and then again, my family members and the other co-hosts that have gotten on, because we enjoy chatting with each other and enjoy learning new things. The podcast just is organically continuing. Because a lot of podcasts die because either run out of material or something, other priorities come up, but that's not the case in this scenario. So I'd recommend finding something like that if you're doing a podcast, something that you can get into and stay into, and other people will also enjoy, and that it won't feel like a chore. Okay, set reasonable expectations. I've had a number of people that I know that have wanted to start a podcast and have tried to kind of shoot for the moon, and it turns out the moon's really far away. And so when you're trying to start a new podcast, you need to have very real expectations. Now, if you are an audio engineer, if you were a sound recording artist or something, and you have the best technology and the best, recording equipment, all those things, then your standard for audio should be very high, right? If you have the best video technology, there are lots of scenarios where you have maybe a particular expertise in an area, a particular set of skills or technology that will afford you a benefit in certain areas in podcasting. Use those, obviously, and you're going to be miles ahead. But that isn't entirely necessary. What's really necessary is refining what you do have. Whatever skills you have, identify them and then implement them. And if that is, putting together a interesting, like I said, library of material, that's, I think, going to be the most important. But if it is video editing, if it's audio editing, it is, adding music and whatever it is, do that, but set reasonable expectations in that area. Don't think, I have to do all of these things, or I can do all of these things. Either way, it's just not true. You're not going to. And you don't need to, at least not, sure, if you want to be out there, go out there and be the number one podcast in the world. You want to be Joe Rogan, you want to be whatever it is. Sure, you probably need a staff, you probably a variety of things, right? But very few of you listening to a Learn It From a Layman podcast are going to be launching with a budget of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe tens or hundreds of dollars is your budget if you want to do this. So be reasonable. This microphone right here, it was purchased as a gift to me after I started the podcast from Matt. And so the quality of my audio is much better than it used to be as a result of that. If you go back and listen, like from 4 years ago, now that's not the case with everyone in the podcast, right? And I don't establish that. Like, sure, if I wanted, once again, like the highest quality audio, I'd have to just knock off half of my co-hosts and or guests that we've had on. I have to say, you can't come on. I don't care. I'd rather have more content of higher quality than better audio quality. If I'm going to get someone on that has a really good information about, we got Mike Vidomsky on, and he had great information about data mining and those types of things and data science. I think actually his audio sounded reasonably good, but we've had other people in the past where their audio just hasn't been quite the same quality. Okay, maybe for a certain podcast segment you need that, and maybe for our podcast it would help. But once again, it's those expectations of, well, this is what I'm going for, this is what I'm trying to achieve. So all right, do things that interest you. I talked about that, but also recognize what is interesting to the public. Because if you do something too esoteric, too eccentric, you're just not going to connect. And if you're looking to get, put something out there that people connect with, you need to put something out there that people can connect with. So let me leave you once again a kind of anecdotal information on. So our top 10 podcasts, we've got 115 podcasts or something like that in our library now, and I track what people have downloaded, and so I have access to all time downloads, and so we, out of 100 and I think maybe 114 now, here's our top 10 list for those interested in finding out what is useful, what is interesting to people. And from just a long list of different topics, right? We've done a lot. Here's what people have really keyed in on. Quantum physics, the basics of quantum physics, is our number one podcast, and it's not close. That's over 40. We're coming up on 50,000 downloads, which for some top 1% podcasts out there is nothing. They sneeze and they wouldn't care about 50,000 downloads. It's nothing to them. But for a podcast like Learn It From a Layman, that's huge, right? That's what's really built us over the years. So quantum physics, number one. Basics of computer science, number 2. Astronomy, basics of astronomy, number 3. Basics of physics, number 4. Basics of economics, number 5. Basics of calculus, number 6. Number 7 is basics of statistics. Number 8, theory of relativity. Number 9, basics of machine learning and AI. And number 10, astronomy, 10 most interesting things about space. So it's probably predictable that to say that at what is an educational podcast, you're going to have these types of podcasts in your top 10 as opposed to some of our more kind of just entertaining podcasts. We talked about terraforming, for example. It's not a school subject. It's not something people are coming to a educational podcast necessarily for. So unless you listen to us routinely, you're probably not going to just pick that one off the list. But we do have a bunch of other podcasts that have not moved the needle in the same way as quantum physics, as computer science. So ones that I thought were very good. Basics of Memory, I thought was going to be a very interesting podcast. We did that one years ago. Didn't really move the needle much, but quantum physics was huge. Now, each one of these has its own story behind it as well, though, right? So you have to take it with a grain of salt as far as saying quantum physics was both interesting, but it also had, I think, a good collection of people on the podcast as far as and then it was structured while having some banter in it. And so once again, how you build each individual episode matters in the way that it performs. So having a structure for the podcast and also having the ability with the people on the podcast to lighten the mood. People come to be entertained, right? See Gladiator. People want something interesting, but they also want to be able to chuckle along. And that's why having co-hosts is huge and very helpful, because right now my jokes by myself, I mean, I think I'm pretty funny. But the reality is having people to banter with is useful, and then you can jump right back into the hard-hitting information of quantum physics. But yeah, that's each one of these, like I said, has their own story, but each one of these has research behind it, and then things that we were interested in, but clearly it's then also something that the public is interested in. And having information that is not so easily available, told in a way and in a consumable fashion, is really the ticket as far as what we've been able to tell. Is if I've got something that, sure, you could read it online, but it's going to be pretty dry, versus I could listen to it, it'll be entertaining, and I also get the information that I want. That's what people connect with, right? And hopefully that's what even this podcast is about. You could go read about how to build a podcast somewhere else. Probably be pretty dry. Hopefully, listening to me, well, I don't know. My wife doesn't particularly care for it. So, okay. That is, let's do a couple more interesting. Okay, so we got the top 10 episodes. And then there's this big part about podcasting. I think I've already said it essentially, but it's staying consistent. And that means, and that's a lesson that it took us a while to really hammer in because of the kind of laid back nature of this podcast, as far as, the expectation set up front is that it was like, oh, we'll just release a podcast whenever we can. Okay, well, that kind of works, but it turns out that people, if you have a following, which we do now, they want a schedule that they can count on. They want to know when they can come back for an episode. And the best performing podcasts are more frequent than our podcast is. They make money, so it's not a fair comparison. All right, but our podcast does need to be predictable enough that we can build an audience still. So right now we're doing podcasts every 2 weeks, predictably. And we release them every Monday, every other Monday, sorry. And before we started doing that, we had some success with building an audience, just once again based on the quality of the content and the interesting information, the subjects that we'd address. But until we started pushing them at a regular interval, we'd have people come and go. And now we have... So I guess now to establish kind of the credentials of the podcast that we've built, and I don't know how these compare. A couple episodes ago, I talked about how we were in the top 5% of podcasts per some metrics, and I don't know. Kind of that is not untrue, but those numbers do change all the time. And in the updated numbers I've seen, we're no longer in the top 5%. We're more like, well, we're certainly top 10%, but it depends on the episode and it depends on the week and a bunch of factors. But we generally get somewhere around 700 to 800 downloads in the first week of our podcast being released. Pretty much all of our podcasts get 1,000 or 2,000 downloads overall. And then if it really hits and is interesting, 10,000, 20,000, right? And here's what you're not going to learn from me or from our podcast is how to really turn this into a big money making podcast, and maybe that'll come in the future. But once again, set expectations. Our expectations were not to make money at any point. I think we chuckled about it. Years ago, but none of us ever had the expectation. Now, the reality is, if you've been listening to us for a couple years, you have heard some ads before or after our podcast. That was kind of accidental, and they're not on right now. I think, but with those ads, we've made like $20. It turns out hosting a podcast costs way more than that yearly. So we're in the red. But once again, establishing expectations and a budget, I don't care. I get to discuss, and I've learned so much from my own podcasts that it's invaluable to me. But monetization, I know that a lot of people that are listening to this are thinking that's really what I want. Sure. You have to build that. And I'm guessing that with a good launch and then good quality library and consistent episodes, you can monetize. What I'm essentially saying is I think we could monetize our podcast at this point. I have no interest in doing so. So it's not going to happen for us in the near future because our interests lie elsewhere. If you here's a teaser. Years ago we teased a merch store. I find that unlikely, mostly because I'd have to do it, and I'm not going to. But or I could make Tim do it. Should I make Tim do it? You can give me feedback on whether or not Tim should do the merch. The reality is, though, that what we are more likely to come out with, and once again, I'd love to hear feedback on what you consider the ways that I don't really want to sell you ads. I want you to come to educate for educational purposes. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take our top 10 episodes and turn them into a book. Learn it from a layman, encyclopedia of information, and we take our top probably 10 episodes, and each one gets a chapter. You get a 10 chapter book, and you get some of our I'd say wit, but efforts at wit, efforts at humor or whatever it might be, along with hopefully some very good information and then some visualization that we haven't done yet. We haven't yet capitalized on our YouTube channel, which might be coming, but that is far more likely because that fits with our expectations and our goals in podcasting. Is we want, once again, educational outcomes, and if you're buying a book, you are getting something that we think is going to be useful to you and also was useful to us in writing it, and maybe we make some money off of that, but maybe we don't. I don't care. Once again, if the outcome of this podcast is for me to grow and learn and to do so with people I like, the audience, while I appreciate having an audience and it does motivate me, it's a cherry on top. It's not the meat of the. You put cherries on meat? That's gross. But you know what I'm saying here. So that's. But once again, we over the years. So the last thing I wanted to talk about before wrapping this podcast was just kind of what the numbers did look like over the course of the last 4 years. So 2019, we launched, and I said we got maybe 100 downloads the first month, and then it dropped to essentially nothing. We had like 10 or 20, like our good months were like 60 downloads, and that lasted for like a year, to the point where if we had had real expectations, we would have given up for sure. As real expectations as far as like monetization or really building an audience right away. Luckily, that was not our goal, so we just continued slogging along. We had a couple podcasts where I was pretty sure they were good, and I was like, nobody cares. Because I'm a layman. I'm Joe Schmo. I'm your local resident computer scientist. Who cares? And my brother's similarly, we're all laymen in that way. Like none of us are famous. None of us have a huge social media following. We're just out there doing our jobs and trying to do our best. And so we're pushing podcasts out that I think are like, that's really good information. And 10 people download them. It's like 2 of those are my mom. So, but that's how it built for a while. And then we pushed. The one that started moving the needle was Basics of Physics. Where Matt talked about the speed of light and the two diverging beams of light and their relative speed, or was it converging? I don't remember. That one started moving the needle. And then calculus took the needle to a new level, where we talked about, Matt took calculus and boiled it down to, how it related to shooting a cannon. I don't remember what he did. Anyway, and then we had the quantum physics one that really just not ratcheted the whole thing up. And all of a sudden we went from 100 on our best month, 100 downloads a month to 100 downloads a day. And it was an order of magnitude better, obviously. And then it went from there. And then, as we published routinely, 2020, 2021, 2022, just building on those numbers to where now we get, on our good days, about 1,000 downloads across our library. Now, it also helps that we have a larger library, so we have more people that can download a variety of material. But on our best days, we're getting 1,000 downloads of our different podcasts across an audience of 800 or 900 people a day. Those are our best days, to be fair. But it is building, and our Spotify listener base is... what is it? People that have subscribed to our podcast get notifications of when we push. It's something like 15,000, somewhere thereabouts. And I saw recently, I actually didn't know. Once again, this is with the expectations that I've set for the podcast. It's I just don't follow some of the things like reviews. I mean, if you want to review us, go ahead. Knock yourself out. But I hope it was nice. If not, maybe tell me instead of a review. I don't care, though. It just doesn't matter. So my nephew, I told him about the podcast, and he didn't know. He's like, oh, I'm going to go look it up. He looks it up on Spotify, and he's like, oh, you have 4.5 stars. 280 reviews. I don't remember what the number was. 200 and something reviews. And I was like, oh, that's more reviews than I thought. 4.5 stars sounds okay. But then I started looking into it, and I'm like, 4.5 stars is actually not great. So I assume when people give us 4.5 stars, it's because of audio quality. But hey, once again, I'd be happy for any type of criticism that people want to levy. And that's, I guess, my last parting information for a podcast is take criticism and search it out and listen to it. So the best criticism I think I've gotten on this podcast, well, Matt loves criticizing me in a good way, just so we're clear. But Tim's wife, Bethany, has given some great feedback. We've had other people have talked about the audio quality. So once again, kind of tried to step up the game a little bit. But take the criticism and improve your podcast. Wherever it is, take it to that next level. That's why we've launched an actual YouTube channel where you can see us. Maybe we'll take it from there to the point where we add in some graphics. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? But once again, with the expectations that we have, it's just kind of as organically happens, such that it doesn't interfere with our day-to-day jobs, our family life, whatever else it is. But podcasting is, I think, an awesome layman thing to do. It's a way for you to share your information with the world in a way that is accessible. It isn't. You don't have to go out there and publish a blockbuster movie. You don't have to know how to host a website. All of those. You just record an audio track, which pretty much anyone can do these days. If you can edit it, great. If not, guess what? You could just push it like that. I do think that and this is some information that for those of you that stuck around for the whole podcast, maybe you've wondered in the past, the music at the beginning and the end of the podcast is actually me, both from our old podcast on the guitar and the piano, which I'm far more accomplished at. There's a reason that our first intro music and out music was like 3 chords on the guitar. That's about my speed. I think maybe a little bit better than that, but not a lot. On the piano, I've spent a long time learning and playing. So some music like that can be helpful, but just having an audio ability to record that, to push it up, and as long as you're sharing information in a way that is palatable and has some ability to connect with the audience, people are going to listen. And whether or not it's 100 for a year and you're okay with that, or it's 10,000 in the first month and you've really taken off, just have that staying power of being able to say, okay, I can build on this, I can make this work, I can go further. So that's the basics of how to build a podcast according to the layman. And our experience here, we're still in the process. We're I don't know where we are. We're top 10% now as far as downloads in the first week, and maybe we continue to grow. It seems like we're organically growing a little bit. 4.5 stars though, Come on, guys. Let's do a little better. And if it doesn't deserve better, which I will, if my co-hosts were here right now, they would all be saying it probably deserves 3. Let's at least tell us why. All right, let's give us some informational feedback. We got Facebook you can hit us up on. We got Gmail you can hit us up on, learningfromalayman@gmail.com. And I do, or one of my co-hosts will follow that. We got Twitter as well. And we are laymen. It might take us multiple days. I think in a few cases it's taken us a couple weeks to get back, but it will happen. And that's, hopefully we can connect more and more, because I think that's the next level in our podcast is this connection with the users. We've had some users in the past that have reached out, and we really appreciate that. We really enjoy hearing from people that are learning from our podcasts. We do have some expertise. We've tried to reach out to people that have expertise, and we've tried to share it in a way that's useful. And that's what I hope that anyone can do that has any desires or designs on making a podcast. So good luck. If you learn something about podcasting that I don't know, feel free to let me know. I'd appreciate it. And we'll be back again next podcast. I promise, I teased this a couple podcasts ago. I will get Peter back on. We'll do another physics podcast, because those are 3 of our top 10, and Peter is in all of those. So you guys really like Peter, or at least physics. And Peter has had his baby that I tried to have him on like 6 months ago, and he said something about having a baby. Yeah. But that has come and gone, and so I think Peter will be available for us in the near future, and we'll give that a go again. But yeah, we'll see you next podcast.